Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, a simple tapering jig for your table saw. Well, I have a project coming up that's going to require me to use a tapering jig. And the pieces that I will be cutting are a little longer than the commercially available tapering jigs out there on the market. And because of that, I will be making one today on the show for use with this project. The thing is that I would like full support of the pieces while I cut them. And while you could do it with a smaller jig, I think I'd feel more secure using one that is actually built big enough to handle the pieces I'll be cutting. So without any more chatting about it, let's get over to the bench and start this off. And the first thing we're going to need is some 3/4 inch plywood. Well, what I have here is a higher quality of plywood. I believe this is an 11 ply laminate. And what I would like to do is I need to take this over to the table saw for starters, and we're going to cut our base for our jig. And for that, I'm going to need a piece that is 18 inches wide, and I want to make it 3.5 feet long. So 42 inches in total length. Pretty simple so far, eh? A 3/4 board, 42 by 18. Now we need a fence. Just as difficult as cutting our base piece, we're going to take the offcut of the plywood over to the table saw and cut ourselves a length. Again, 42 inches long, but this one's going to be 3 inches wide. And these two pieces are essentially the only two pieces you need for your tapering jig. You have your base or your sled bottom piece and your fence. We now need to make arrangements or adjustments or accommodations for hardware. Well, what I will be using for the hardware that will fasten our fence to our sled or to our base is some 1/4 inch T-bolts. These are a 1/4 20 thread, they're 2 inches long, but before we can do anything, we need to route a recess in the bottom of our base that is going to house the T part of our T-bolt. So for that, what I'm going to need is a 9/16 of an inch diameter straight bit, and we're going to head over to the router table. Well, in order to accommodate for the head of my T-bolt, I have my 9/16 inch diameter straight bit here in the router table. I have it set to a height of 5/32, and that should give me a little bit of extra play there with the thickness of the actual head of the bolt. I also have start and stop marks drawn on my fence. I don't know if you guys know this, but when you have a white router fence like this, feel free to mark with it or on it with pencil for start and stop marks. You can erase it afterwards and it leaves no lasting marks on there. So it's a great reference, almost like a storyboard built right into your router table. Either way, the fence is set, so the center of this recess is going to be 4 inches back from the edge of our base plate of our jig, and I'm just going to route one recess on both sides of our board on the underside. And before you carry on much further, you just want to make sure that the recess is deep enough for your T-bolts and that everything is fine there. This is a little larger than I would need, but I knew that when I chose the 9/16 inch bit. So we've got this recess done. The thing is now, we need another recess just like it, end to end on our fence, right down the middle of the bottom. So I'm going to, just like I did before, mark some starts and stops on my fence, and we're going to route this same recess end to end all the way along the middle of our fence. And there we have our slot, stop dado, groove, whatever you want to call it, in our fence. We now need a through slot that will allow our bolt to pass through the fence. And seeing that we already have the fence set up for this piece, we might as well do this one next. So I've installed a 5/16 diameter straight bit here in our router table. I know that I said I'm going to be using 1/4 inch diameter hardware, but I like a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to those T-bolts sliding easily through my fence or through the base. So we're going to use 5/16 diameter. I'm going to use my same start and stop points, and I'm going to do these through cuts in 2 passes so that it's not so hard on the bit. And there is our slot cut in our fence. Now I decided while I was doing it actually to do it in 3 passes rather than just 2. I didn't want to go too hard on the bit, but we can see that slides nicely from end to end of the fence, no problems there, and you can tighten it down, no problem there either. So now that we have that done, we can put this aside for now, and we need to do the exact same procedure for each of our end slots on our base. So we're going to reset the fence on the router table. We're going to do it in 3 passes because I like the way that worked out, using the same start stops, and we'll get our through 5/16 groove cut in both ends of our base plate. Well, the next piece that I have is a 1/2 inch thick piece of ply. It's cut to 3/4 of an inch wide and 4 inches long. And we're just going to glue it and screw it into the end of our fence. And this will be for our keeper, our stop. It will hold the stock from going beyond the fence. So we'll get this screwed into place and then we can move on. Well, there's one more thing that I want to do to the fence, and that is because of this slot that runs end to end along the entire length, the fence flexes. And I don't like that. So what I've got is a couple maple keepers. They're the same thickness as the depth of our track, and 1/3 of the way in, I'm going to glue in a keeper and sand it flush, and 1/3 of the way in from the other side, I'm going to glue in another keeper and sand that flush, and that will stop our fence from flexing. It will prevent us from sliding our T-bolts end to end, but that's okay. I can deal with that. If I would have thought of it initially, I would have left a good 2-inch section in the middle here to keep it from flexing. Well, now it's time to assemble the jig. And the first thing we'll do is drop a couple of our T-bolts down through our fence. And we'll flip it over. And what these are for will be for some hold downs to hold our stock while cutting. So we'll just place a washer on there and then a couple of jig knobs just to hold that in place for now, and then one over at this end. And now the last step in assembling this jig is we'll take our 2-inch T-nuts, or T-bolts rather, up through our slot in our base and up through the slot in our fence. And with a washer, we will attach our fence to our base. And that, my friends, is our taper jig finished. So how do you use it? Well, over here at the table saw, we're just going to slide our fence over with our jig in place. We're going to slide it over until our jig just barely kisses the blade. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the blade up so that it is over the jig and the proper height to cut the stock that I'm looking to cut. Now I'm just going to be using this junk piece of plywood here just to demonstrate. Let's say that this is the taper that we want to do. So I'm going to draw this taper out. This is what I want to cut. And now we're just going to, once we get it lined up with our keeper at the back, we're going to slide it over to make sure that the edges line up with the edge of the board and with our blade. So you go in and we'll tighten down the fence on our jig. And now for a hold down, we'll just spin one of these over and tighten this down to hold our piece in place. And at this point in time, you're ready to make your cut. And just like that, you have your taper cut. Wasn't that easy? So there's another feature of this which kind of makes it cool. Let's pretend, let's pretend that this is a rough cut board and this edge here is all woogity and you don't have a jointer. It's no problem. Loosen up your fence, line up your board so that you can sight it down so that you can see it's going to take off a section of your rough cut board and it's going to straighten it out. So line it up here against your fence and against your keeper back here. Tighten down your fence. Get your hold down here. And if you wanted to, if you're not secure with the one, you could bring the other one down here below our keepers at the back. But tighten it down with your lockdown, and once you get it in place, make your cut. And if this were a rough sawn board or a rough cut board with a irregular edge, you would now have a flat edge no matter what. It didn't matter if this was holding tight against the fence or if it was offset. As long as you had it clamped down and you made your cut, you would still end up with one straight edge here as a reference point. From there, you could square it off or whatever you wanted to do. So there's an extra little use for this jig, but all in all, it's a simple jig to make. And there you have it. A simple tapering jig for your table saw. Guys, there is tons of room for modification on this jig. Now, for me, and probably for you, this jig is very oversized, but I need to cut some pieces that are 3-foot long tapers, and I would rather have the full support of that board onto the jig. I didn't want anything overhanging or any pieces unsupported, hence the 42-inch length of my jig. If the 42 inches does not work for you, then don't make it 42 inches. If you want it to be 24 or 28 or 30 or whatever you like, shorten it up. Shorten it up, shorten the fence, make it your own. You don't have to follow my dimensions. As I've said on the show many times, what I show you here and the methods that I show you are merely a suggestion. And honestly, feel free to use your own methods, to do it your own way. If you don't have the equipment or the tools that I have, make it your own. And as long as you're being safe about it, who's to say that you're right or wrong? Guys, this jig runs against the fence. Now, I did that for simplicity. I honestly don't know if I'm going to keep this jig once the project I need it for is done. I have a small shop and this is a big fixture. So I didn't want to add a runner strip for the miter slot. I did not want to add that miter bar. So for me, it runs against the fence. But if you want to add a miter bar, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. All you need to do is, once you get your slots cut for your fence and that sort of thing, attach your miter bar, run it through the table saw so that it trims off the one side even with where your blade protrudes to the table, and there you go. You are always now running at that miter slot parallel to your table saw blade, and you're good to go. So if you want that miter bar, put the miter slot bar. There's nothing wrong with that either. As far as the fence goes, guys, I pulled a bit of a boner move with putting that routed slot all the way from end to end. And as I said in the show, if I would have had it back, I probably would have left a 2-inch section right in the middle to give that fence some rigidity. But hindsight is 20/20. I got a little overzealous with my router table, but there's a way to fix it. So again, just glue those keepers in, and then I used a block plane to take it flush and then sand it down after that. Don't freak out, it's no big deal. We made a bit of a goof, we fixed it up, and everything's good to go, and the jig works just like it always was meant to. As far as these hold downs goes, guys, if you don't have them, you don't need to use them. If you have in your shop those toggle hold downs and you just want to use that to hold down your stock instead of the style that I used here, so be it. For that, you don't even need to put the routed groove in your fence, because you can just screw those toggle clamps right down to the fence itself. No need for a T-bolt to slide back and forth. If you're not happy with the store-bought styles, I did show on one of the programs on the channel how to make your own. So I'm going to post a link to that, and you can make your own hold downs if you want. Same thing with the jig knobs. If you don't have the store-bought jig knobs that I used in this jig, don't sweat it. Make your own. It's simple, it's an easy process, and again, I'll post a link to that down below. Guys, these are just jig knobs that I had lying around, and if you don't have it, make your own out of stuff you've already got lying around your shop. This jig could be potentially made from scrap and stuff you got lying around. Guys, this jig came out of necessity. And that's okay, because I've gone a long time without a taper jig, and there has been many times that I've needed to cut a taper, and I've had to do some pretty inventive stuff in order to get those tapers cut. It's nice to finally have a jig in the shop that's going to cut them for me and cut them safely, so that I don't have to worry about maybe losing a couple of these digits at some point in time. Better to have the jig and cut them safely than to do an alternative method and maybe compromise some of your safety. So it's a good jig to have. If you haven't already, guys, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the bell so that you don't miss the notifications of future episodes of the show. This has been a simple build today, but a very useful one, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I also hope that you're going to try it yourself, and more importantly, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.